Hi, my name is Kevin Jones, and in this walkthrough, we'll see how we can use the rock-solid knowledge Saml component as a service provider, and we'll be using Okta as the identity provider. So in previous walkthroughs, we've used the Saml component both as an IDP inside IdentityServer and then as a service provider against the IdentityServer IDP. We'll be doing the same here, but using Okta as the IDP. And also, we'll be using the latest version of the Saml component. So what we'll have is this. We'll have an application, and part of that application will require authentication. And we'll use Saml to supply that authentication. To do that, we'll use Okta as the identity provider. So Okta will provide the login for us. So our application will redirect to Okta to authenticate. Once we've authenticated there, we'll redirect back to the application. Within the application, we'll use the RSK component to be the Saml service provider. So this is the component that will talk to Okta to complete the Saml authentication. So I'll be using JetBrains Rider to create the project. And inside there, we'll just be creating an MVC project. So you could do exactly the same thing inside Visual Studio. So we'll go File, New. And from here, we'll have an ASP.NET Core Web Application project. I'm going to call the overall solution Saml Okta, and we'll call the project SP for Service Provider. And making sure that's in the right directory, we can then create the project. So this is a standard MVC project, and I want to add a couple of things before we go and configure Okta. The first thing I want to do is this. So inside the views, inside the shared view on the layout, I'm going to add an extra entry to the navbar, and this will be our secured entry. I'll copy one of these values here. We're going to set the action to details and the title to details. And then in my home controller, we add a new action called details, and this will just return a view. And then we can add that details view inside the view's home folder. And inside this view, I'm going to list out all the claims that have been passed across in the token after we authenticate. So we have a header here, and these claims will be in an unordered list. So we say UL, and then add a for each. And after we authenticate, we'll get a user instance, and that user instance will contain all of the claims. So we can iterate over those claims. So I can say var claim in user.claims. Then I can add each of these into the list. So we can display them something like this. We display the claim type and the claim value. And then finally back in the controller, I'll add the authorized attribute to the details action. So we can't hit this action unless we are authenticated. Okay, so let's go and start the configuration of the service provider. To do that, I again need to be inside startup.cs. And then down here, as well as calling use authorization, I need to call use authentication. And be sure to call these in the right order. So authentication first, followed by authorization. If you don't do this, you end up in a redirect loop. We're going to use rock-solid knowledge's Saml component. So for my project, I go to Manage NuGet Packages. And I'm looking for the rsk.saml.IdentityServer 4 component here. And then once we have that, we can configure it. And we configure this inside the configure services method. And we'll do this in a couple of steps. We'll do the initial configuration here. We'll then go to Okta and set up Okta's Saml integration. And then we'll come back and finish off the configuration. So here to configure, we do services.add authentication. And this takes some options. So inside here, we have to specify the default authentication scheme. This is the name of the cookie that we'll use to manage this authentication. And we'll just call this cookie. And we'll set what's known as the default challenge scheme. And we give this a name. In this case, we'll call this SAML2. And then when we configure SAML, we'll give that scheme the same name. So once we have that, we call add cookie using the name we gave above, and then add SAML2p. And it's the add SAML2p call that comes from the rock-solid knowledge component. We give this a name, and we give it the same name as the default challenge scheme above. And again, we give this some options. And some of these options we'll set now, and some we'll set after we've configured Okta. So what do we need here? So first of all, we need to set a license key. So you can get a demo license key by going to IdentityServer.com, finding the Saml component, and requesting a key from there. And that's what I'm going to use here. We then tell it what the ID claim type is, and ours is going to be sub for subject. We give it the callback path. This is the path that Okta will call back in on. In our case, we can just give that sign-in-saml. We tell it which scheme to use, and that matches the scheme we specified above in the default authentication scheme. So that's just going to be cookie. And then we need to set some IDP specific options, and we won't have those until we go and configure Okta. So after the IDP specific options, we also need to set what are known as service provider options. Remember, we are the service provider here, and these options will be used when Okta and our code, the service provider, interact. So for these service provider options, we provide the entity ID, which is a unique identifier for this service provider. And I'm just going to use the URL here. Okay, so now that we have this set up, apart from the IDP options, we can go and configure Okta. So we've got to the point where we now need to configure Okta. So I'm in the Okta admin console, and from here, I can do add application. We'll click on create new app. It's going to be a web platform, and we're going to use SAML2 as the sign-in method. So I click on create. So we give the application a name. So I'll just call this RSK test app. Then we can click on the next button, and then from here we configure SAML. So we need to specify first of all the single sign-in URL. So this is the URL we configured when we were setting up our service provider. So in the service provider, we set this callback path. So this URL is a combination of the URL that the service provider is running on plus this callback path. So this is going to be https localhost 5002/signin-saml. So the audience URI matches the entity ID. So that's going to be this value here. So https localhost 5002/saml. And we're not going to change anything else. So we don't need the default relay state, and we don't need to change any of the other settings. So once we have that, I can go next. And then we end up on the last page, and this is just Okta gathering information about us. So we click on I'm an Okta customer in this case, and then click on finish. So the Okta site is now set up. And then from here, we can look at that configuration. So for example, if I click on view setup instructions, it takes me to another page, which shows things like the identity provider issuer and a URL that we need to use, and also a copy of the certificate that Okta is going to use as part of the SAML conversation. So the other thing on this page is a link to the identity provider metadata, and we'll need that in a moment. Okay, so now that we have that, let's go back and finish the configuration of the application. So back in here, where I've said IDP specific options, we can now add the information from Okta. So the RSK SAML component can make use of the metadata provided by Okta. So instead of having to configure things individually, I can just point the component at that metadata. And I do that by doing options.identity provider metadata address equals. And if I go back to the Okta page, and then right click and copy this link address for the identity provider metadata and paste that in. So this is the simplest way to configure the service provider. Okay, so now that we have this metadata address, we need to provide two more things. The first is to set this require valid metadata signature option to false. And this stops the SAML component checking to see if the incoming SAML information has been signed correctly. So when we're using Okta, we don't need to check that signature. And the other thing you may need to set here, and you may need to play with this, is the time comparison tolerance. So when the SAML exchange happens, both sides check to make sure that the data they're getting isn't out of date. And sometimes these clocks are skewed. This value is in seconds. So if I set that to 120, we're saying we have a tolerance of 2 minutes here. There's one more thing we need to do on the Okta side. So at the moment, we have the SAML set up, but we haven't assigned any users to use this application. So if I go to assignments and do assign to people, I'm the only person currently in this group, so I can assign myself to this, save, and say done. So we now have one user that's allowed to use this sign-on. Then if I go back to Rider and run the service provider. Okay, so inside the browser then, if I go into Okta and make sure I'm signed out, if I refresh the page, it takes me back to the sign-in page. And I go back to the application and click on Details. It takes me off to Okta and asks me to sign in. And when I sign in, it redirects me back to my application. And on here, it shows the claims. So for example, it's showing my name identifier as kevin@knowledgespike.com. So we can see once we have Okta configured, given access to the metadata, it's relatively straightforward to configure the RSK component, as it will just link to the metadata and pull back all the information that it needs. So I hope you found this useful, and I hope you now understand how to configure Okta to work with the rock-solid knowledge SAML component.